Yeah, we are live.
Welcome everyone to the first keynote session for this year's Bird Monitoring India Symposium. If you're joining us for the first time today, welcome. Please head on over to Discord where you can follow along and ask questions to the speaker once she's done with the keynote talk. We've had a wonderful day of talks and posters today, and I've learned so much about passive acoustic monitoring. I'm excited and honored to introduce the speaker for today's keynote talk, Dr. Laurel Symes. Laurel works at the intersection of ecology, evolution, conservation, and technical development. She conducts research across a variety of taxa, including insects, frogs, bats, and birds, in both temperate and tropical systems. Specifically, she's interested in the evolution of signaling rates and how often animals repeat signals over days, months, or years. Laurel received her PhD from Dartmouth University in 2013. Her dissertation examined the evolution of mate recognition in Acanthus tree crickets. Laurel has published extensively across the top journals in the field, including Evolution, The American Naturalist, Animal Behavior, and the Proceedings of the Royal Society, to name a few. At present, Laurel is the Assistant Director of the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. At the center, she works towards maximizing the accessibility and effectiveness of acoustic tools for research and conservation. She also coordinates the Tropical Biology Research Program with a focus in Central and South America, and works with teams from Central Africa and Southeast Asia to develop research approaches and tools that span tropical terrestrial habitats. In today's keynote, Laurel will talk to us about recent research conducted with passive acoustic monitoring, and will highlight the range of questions and scales that are enabled by this approach. Personally, I'm very fortunate to be working with Laurel at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and even in the brief time that I've known her, she's been a wonderful mentor and colleague. Thanks again, Laurel, for accepting our invitation and being up super early to give a talk. Over to you.
Hello, it's so good to be here with you today. It's a thank you, Vijay, for the introduction, and a special thanks to the organizers for putting this together and inviting me to join you. I was so sorry to miss the presentations earlier today. I'm traveling, and with the time zone difference, it was quite early, so I will look forward to seeing many of those talks soon on Zoom. But to orient you to the presentation that I'll share today, there'll be two broad parts of it. The first will be focused on research questions and topics that can be addressed with passive acoustic monitoring. And this will draw from a combination of work that I've done, work that others have done, primarily birds, but we'll throw in a few other species just for fun and diversity. And then the second part will be very much a practical introduction to passive acoustic monitoring, with some conversation about equipment and deployment, how do you organize large quantities of data as they come in, and what are some of the analysis strategies for biological interpretation of these really long recordings. So to start with, I think there's been quite a bit of discussion already today about passive acoustic monitoring. And it's essentially the idea of putting recording equipment in an environment and leaving it there for a period of time to capture sounds of animals, human activity, and abiotic sources. But there are a variety of different questions that you can ask with this technology and approach. And we're still continuing to add to the list as the technology becomes more widespread and better supported by statistical approaches. But it's really easy to come to passive acoustic monitoring with a particular set of questions or desires that can turn out to be either relatively easy to address or comparatively challenging. So just to contextualize those, some of the things that have been comparatively easy to start with are things like detecting species present. So being able to put recorders in environments and then either have them reviewed by human listeners or automated approaches to ask what species are present. It's much more difficult to ask what species are absent because they just might not be captured on a particular recording, or they might not be vocal. There's been some really neat work done recently on individual behavior. So we often think of passive acoustic monitoring as a strategy for understanding communities or populations, but researchers have begun putting, for example, recording units with individual nests or in territories to be able to quantify what time of year different territories are occupied, Are certain territories settled earlier than others? How much do territorial males sing? What are song differences? Can you actually recognize individual birds and map their movement across the landscape? Other questions that have been addressed with passive acoustic monitoring include the phenology of acoustic activity. So when are species vocally active? Again, this requires a longer stretch of recording, but can be done by looking at species presence on those recordings. Some of the things that start to get a bit more challenging are things like quantifying the relative abundance. A lot of people come to passive acoustics wanting to know how many of an animal are in a habitat. And that can be really difficult because you have to make assumptions about how often different individuals are vocalizing, and that may change depending on what time of the year it is, whether they're nesting, whether they're defending territories, the ratio of males and females, all sorts of different things. But one of the places that we can sort of pause on the way to estimating true abundance is to ask how many detections you get of different species in different habitats. So we'll look at some examples of that also. There's some neat work being done now on approaches that involve occupancy modeling. So using acoustics presence data to make some inferences about when species might have been present but not detected, what other sorts of habitats they might be found in. And then some of the really quite challenging ones are things like density estimation, where again, you need a lot of information about signaling rates, movement patterns, and things like that to really understand how what you're collecting on a microphone translates to how many individuals are in the habitat. So I'll walk through a few examples of some of these different types of questions and approaches and places where passive acoustics has been really useful for understanding populations and species. So one of the places, as probably most of you have encountered already, where acoustics can be really useful is when it's hard to see a bird. A lot of birding in tropical environments is done by ear rather than by sight because the habitats can be quite dense. And this is another example of where it can be tricky to detect species presence. So this right here is a bittern. And it's unusual to see them in this sort of open environment. Often they like to hang out in this tall vegetation where they're incredibly well camouflaged, and it's really difficult to see them. And so these researchers looked at the relative effectiveness of human observers and passive acoustic equipment to detect when bitterns are present. And so this has been an ongoing monitoring project in New Zealand with field observers. So it costs about $50,000 in New Zealand dollars every year to send observers to multiple sites at a specific time of day to stand and listen for this bird. And these researchers were able to match a lot of these listening locations with autonomous recorders, so these passive acoustic devices, which carries a cost also. You still have to get them out there, you have to buy the equipment, the batteries, the data storage. But compared to especially paying a large number of observers to be on site at a very specific time of day, this allowed relatively few people to sample many sites by going back through recordings. So that can be done in the lab at other times of year. And they found a very tight correspondence between the number of calls that people were hearing and the number of calls that they were detecting on recording devices. Do note that the number of calls detected by observers tended to be a bit higher than what was on recording devices in some of these sites, but pretty close overall. And so in this particular scenario, there was a substantial cost savings. And on an ongoing basis, they've combined both the acoustic monitoring and the field observer. So it's been a synergy allowing the field observers to do other types of research and data collection beyond just visiting these sites at very specified times. And note that at this point, they were not using automated detectors. So this was all based on being present in the field and then bringing the recordings back and listening to them or visually reviewing them. So there's no computer-assisted review of these files. So the conclusion of the authors was that the recording devices provided data that was similar to what was collected by field observers, but at a much lower cost, and allowed them to implement other sampling regimes that they had thought would be impossible, but now they could sample more sites on more dates and things like that. So this is a whale example in a bird meeting, but it's a neat example of using acoustics to quantify phenology. And one of the reasons that some of our best examples of this come from marine systems is that passive acoustic monitoring was used much more widely in marine systems before it was available enough and affordable enough to be used in terrestrial systems. So when we're talking data sets of 10 or 15 or 20 years, often those are coming from marine systems. So this is an example from off of the east coast of the United States in Massachusetts Bay. And there's a very highly endangered species of whale that makes heavy use of this area. So there are less than 400 of them left. And one of the major threats to these whales are ship strikes. And so people were very interested in understanding when the whales were present, where they were present, and being able to set shipping speed accordingly. So there were 19 recorders deployed over about 4,000 square kilometers and captured nearly 50,000 hours of recording over about 6 years. And so these were analyzed as they were collected, but it allowed researchers to assess not just presence and absence, but hourly acoustic presence. So you get something between, are they just there or not there, where there's some information about how often they're detected, which probably correlates with activity levels, how many there are, things like that. But at the same time, there are also times when these animals are present and not making very much sound, or just a few individuals are making a lot of sound. So it's still not an absolute estimate of density, but you start to get a sense of how much is going on in the bay. And so it was converted to percent presence over a longer period of time as well to even out some of those fluctuations. These are just examples of the equipment going into the water. So what we see here is starting in the summer of the year and going through the summer of the following year. So this starts in 2007 and runs into the summer of 2008. And so in the summer and fall, there were very few detections of these whales, almost absent. But then by winter and spring, there were lots and lots of detections. And that pattern sort of repeats across years until you get to 2010, 11, and 12, where the number of summer and fall detections is going up. The number of winter and spring detections is a little bit lower. And so this is data from 2012. At this point, we know that they have become much more present throughout the year, as well as are shifting north in their range. And so what we're seeing is by monitoring year after year, you pick up pretty broad scale changes in how animals are using habitat when they're present. And so one of the things that's come out of this is connecting with colleagues farther north in Canada to say, these whales are present throughout the year here. There used to be a strong migration and protections in place around when shipping speeds and fishing equipment was modified in order to minimize harm to whales, but now we really need to understand where they're at in order to minimize anthropogenic activity. Turning back to birds, some of the other types of questions that we can ask with passive acoustic monitoring include these relative detection rates, trying to understand how intensively a species is using a habitat by determining how many vocalization activities you get. So this is research that colleagues and I have been doing in the northeastern US, up here in New Hampshire, in 2 different sites. There are 2 forests that are separated by about 20 kilometers. And within each forest, there's mature undisturbed forest as well as regrowth after logging that's about 60 years old. And so it gives us a chance to look at different scales of replicated habitat to ask what habitats birds are using. And so this is an example of the type of data that we get. This is an ovenbird, so North American bird. But we went to the 2 different sites and said, how many vocalizations do we typically detect of this species in 10 minutes? And so if we'd just been doing presence-absence assessment, we would say this bird is present in both places, in both habitats. And that would have been the extent of the information that we get. But by counting the number of calls, you can see that in both forests, it's more represented in mature forest than it is in middle-aged forest. And so this could have a few different drivers. It might be that sound transmits better through a mature forest. It's more open than a mid-aged forest where there's more growth, or that there's more food in a mature forest. And so there are the same number of birds and they're singing more often. But it might also represent the fact that there are more ovenbirds present in these more mature forests. And that So a nice opportunity to combine acoustic observation with visual observation, mist netting, things like that, to really begin to parse out these patterns. At the same time, we can begin to pick up broader differences between forests and between sites. So these two species, the black-throated green warbler and the winter wren, in both cases, we see higher detection rates at one forest than we do at the other. So Hubbard Brook had higher representation of both species and tends to be at a slightly higher elevation, which might be more suited to the nesting behavior of these species. We also see things that aren't easily explained by simple one forest versus another, or one forest type versus another forest type. So this is a red-eyed vireo. And here at one forest, we see similar numbers in mature and middle-aged forest. The other forest, there's pretty dramatic differences in how many vocalizations we get. And so that's where we really need to combine these acoustic methods with field biology to understand what's going on in these habitats that layers on top of just what forest it's in, what forest type it's in, to support or different population levels of these species or different calling levels. And we can also use these data to make sometimes helpful visualizations. So what you're seeing in each of these short videos is the progression through the season. And each of these red dots represents a different recording site. So these are places where we had passive acoustic units. And on each date, we counted how many calls were detected at a given unit. And so you can see certain dates where there's higher calling activity, perhaps based on weather, but also there's a strong elevational gradient here. And it allows us to visualize when our birds very vocally active at low elevations, at high elevations. Is it the same between closely related species? So you can use these data to make some nice visualizations that also help inform hypothesis development. So if you're thinking about implementing passive acoustic monitoring, one of the questions that often comes up is, how many recorders do I need? How long should I put them out? And we found these sorts of analyses to be quite helpful for thinking about how to invest energy in passive acoustic monitoring. So what you're seeing here is the number of days that are analyzed from a particular site. And on the y-axis is how many bird species you detect. So if you put one recording unit out for one day in these forests, you often detect 4 to 5 species. What happens if you leave that unit there for a second day? Well, you'll pick up some additional species. By 6 days, you've picked up almost twice, more than twice the original number. And then by 10, 15 days, you're starting to see an asymptote. And so we can relate this to the ecological concepts of alpha and beta diversity, where alpha is the number of species that you expect on one recorder on one day. Beta is how that diversity increases through time as you, rather than investing more sampling effort in the same leaf litter patch, for example, you invest more sampling effort by looking at additional days of recording. And then gamma diversity allows us to talk about the difference between how many species we would detect if we left the recorder in one site versus if we had recorders in 10 different sites. And so in this case, you can see by recording in 10 sites, we actually pick up another 4 or 5 species. But a lot of the species that we're going to detect, we detect from a single recording unit. So if you're thinking about limited financial resources, limited field sampling activity, it's sort of a way of thinking this curve might be very different, for example, in tropical environments where there's a lot more species. It might be different at different times of year, if species are holding territories versus moving through the environment. At times of year when they're signaling a lot, these curves may increase faster. But it's a way of starting to visualize the investment in sampling versus how many detections of species you'll get. And moving toward the more complicated end of the spectrum of questions, this is an example from a project in California, so in the western part of the United States, where the researchers are interested in understanding the interactions between barred owls and spotted owls. So spotted owls have historically been in this habitat. Barred owls are coming into the habitat as a local invasive as humans modify and change the habitat. So historically, it's been hard for the barred owl to move through the matrix of habitats and occupy sites. But as humans open clearings and corridors, it's become much easier for it to access some of these older sites. So the researchers put out in this initial survey about 200 recorders. They now have about 2,000 throughout the state, and looked at what percentage of the recorders were detecting barred owls and what percentage were detecting spotted owls. And typically you don't detect both species at the same site. So there's very strong competition between them, where if you have one species, you won't have the other. And typically when a barred owl shows up in a spotted owl territory, the spotted owl is evicted. So they found that spotted owl occupancy was relatively stable still in these cases. It had declined a bit, but not significantly. But during the sampling period of just a couple of years, the occupancy of these invasive barred owls was going up rapidly. And so they were colonizing these older forests and called for pretty urgent management. Once they reach a certain occupancy, it's very difficult, even through removals, to bring their numbers back down and allow spotted owls to recover, which tends to be quite slow. But the researchers also wanted some additional information on what animals were where, what types of breeding was going on. And so one of the neat things about the species is that both males and females make sounds, but the sounds are at different frequencies or pitches. So when they hoot, the females, I believe, tend to be lower than the males. And so you can look not just what species is present, but is it a single male? Is it a mating pair? Things like that. And so onto this initial presence-absence grid, they were also able to map places where there's pairs of these invasive owls, just a single male, where they're not detecting the invasive owls. And so it allowed very targeted control efforts where people could go specifically to territories that had pairs and either capture these owls for use in zoos and educational programs, or in some cases remove them entirely. So the second part of the talk, I'll turn much more to the practical aspects of passive acoustic monitoring. This will be a very quick overview. There's a lot more material on all of these things. I've provided a Word document that has some links and information about some of the topics that I'll touch on. And we're also happy to answer questions if there's any place where we can be useful. So thinking about equipment, that's when I started doing passive acoustic monitoring, was one of the initial hurdles for me, is what do I actually buy? What's on the market? What can I get access to? What are going to be the important features? And so some of the features that we tend to think about for passive acoustic monitoring equipment are how long can it run in the field? There's a lot of variation between models of equipment. Some can run for a couple of weeks, some can run for a few months. There's a few that can be connected to a solar panel and run for even longer periods of time. One of the most important parameters is how much does it cost? If you're deploying equipment in remote areas, how much it weighs can be a big factor also. So if you're carrying 10 or 15 units in the backpack for a multi-day hike, that can add up to 10 or 15 kilos and really change the experience compared to smaller units that might be lighter. What is the sampling rate? So many of you may be familiar with sampling rate already. If you aren't, it controls what range of frequencies or pitches you can record. So for example, bats occur at very high frequencies, and in order to capture those high frequency sounds, you need a very high sampling rate. Other things like elephants, anthropogenic sounds occur at a very low frequency, and you need a lower frequency sampling rate to capture those low sounds. So depending on what types of sounds you're interested in, different sampling rates will make sense. How durable is the unit? Often you can get less expensive units, but if you're planning a multi-year project, they may not last through the duration of the project. And what are the scheduling options? Can you schedule it with a phone, with a tablet, with a computer? Can you set it for different sampling rates, different days, things like that? And so I recognize this is a lot of text on one slide. This image is also in the handout that we'll share later, but it captures a few of the major models of equipment that are available currently and some of these key features. So what is the price of the unit? Note that this figure is about a year old, and with some of the supply chain shortages, some of these prices have been going up and down quite a bit. But we'll tell you things like the weight of the unit and any particular specialized features. Operating time will be one of the most important variables for picking equipment, but it's a difficult thing to put in a single number in a table because it depends on what your recording settings are. If you ask the unit to record 24 hours a day, that will require more battery and will result in shorter recording life than if you're only recording for 10 minutes every morning, for example. So units will use battery both when they're recording and when they're sitting and waiting to record. So there's a combination of those that will probably serve the needs of your project, either recording continuously for as long as you're able to, or starting to reduce the amount of recording that you do per day to extend that life, knowing that if you record half as much, you don't completely double the amount of time that you can record for it. It goes up, but not by twice as much because the batteries are still being used even while it's waiting. Just a side note, in addition to these devices, there are a variety of other recording units that people have used. There's a whole field of ultrasonic recording equipment that's specialized for bats, but people have also been doing things like repurposing cell phones to capture acoustic data. When you're deploying equipment, a few things to think about. Some of the earliest projects I did, I had recording units that were scattered through a forest, and then I was analyzing the data and found an example of this cool rare bird on the first recording unit. And then later I was analyzing another recording unit, and I found another example of this cool rare bird. And then when I matched up the date and time, I found that actually I was picking up the same bird on 2 different recording units. And so for some applications, this isn't a big deal. But if you're trying to maximize your ability to sample an area, and if you're trying to equate how often things are detected with how often they're present, it's important to understand whether your units are each independent samples or whether there's some overlap in what they're capturing. So often we see that something around 200 meters between units means that most of them are not capturing the same vocalization on 2 different units. But sometimes an easier way to think about that is the units are similar in sensitivity to our hearing. So if you were standing in a spot, would you be able to hear the same bird where you're standing and where your second unit is placed? Something else that's been quite useful for us in the process of deploying equipment is to make use of checklists. I can't tell you how many times I've had to walk back to a vehicle, back to a camp, go back to the lab because there's some key piece that's not there. You might, especially the first time you do it, you often are careful and have everything. But by the time you've done it a few times, you'll get out there and not have the cable that connects the tablet and the unit, or not have enough SD cards that are pre-labeled to put into a recording unit. And that connects to just the idea of bringing extra of everything. So you might go out and discover that one of your microphones is missing. In the northeastern US, we have bears that like to chew on microphones. So sometimes we have to replace a microphone, or even a whole tree will have fallen and destroyed a unit. And so if it's very important to have that site on a continuous basis, it's very useful to have an extra recording unit with you so that you don't then end up doing a half-day hike back because one of the 10 units that you were servicing in that day is no longer functional, and having to go and get an extra one and make a second trip back to that site. So the longer I've done this, the more extra equipment I've started bringing, and the more carefully I've been checking everything that I have along. When you're putting up equipment, it's often useful to, or it's often tempting to pick like the very biggest tree in a site. And working in the tropics, sometimes that biggest tree can be really big. And it's like, I know I can find it again. It's on the centrally located recording spot. But when you end up with a really big tree, you're also ending up with a really big obstacle for sound that will be coming into the recording unit. And so often the most effective mounting locations are trees that are somewhat similar in diameter to the recording unit. It doesn't matter very much if it's a little bigger, but if you end up with a tree that matches the unit fairly well, then you're minimizing the amount of sound that gets blocked as it comes into the microphone. Something else to keep in mind is if you are mounting units with some sort of strap or cord, make sure that you get a hold of the end of that cord and wrap it up and tuck it in. We sometimes see deployments where there's a strap that's dangling, and when you put the unit up, it's nice and peaceful and quiet. And then after you leave, the wind picks up. And so instead of a month of recording birdsong, what you have is a month of the strap going in the wind. And it can make it difficult for human reviewers. It can make it particularly difficult to apply automated methods. So if you're imagining coming back and using computer assistants to go through your recordings, you might end up instead going through them all by hand. And also just keep in mind that the microphones that are used on these recorders are in a really harsh environment. It can be wet, hot. There are things that might chew on them. When you buy a unit, hopefully that unit will last you for many years, but typically the microphones will need to be replaced more often. So we have a project in Central Africa that's monitoring elephants. And about 4 years into the project, they noticed that they were detecting many fewer elephants. It's like, oh, are the populations declining? What's going on? And when they went back and checked the sensitivity of their microphones, it had declined quite a bit, so that their pickup radius had gone from being substantial to being much smaller. And so it made it very difficult to make any sort of inference about the population change. And instead, what was mostly reflected in the data set was a change in microphone sensitivity. And so every 1 to 2 years, depending on the specifics of the question and the project and the budget, be thinking about replacing those microphones. If you're just making a list of what species are present, that might not be that big of a deal. If you're trying to compare detection rates across different types of habitats, that might matter a lot. And just another practical tip, if you have recording sites that you're using on a long-term basis, consider whether you're able to use 2 different sets of memory cards for those units. So you can imagine if it's a full day to hike to 10 units, you might end up going out and picking up an SD card from each unit, coming back to the lab, downloading them. Then you have class, you have a paper to submit. It's now 10 days before you're able to do that hike a second time and put the cards back in the units. But if you have an A set and a B set of cards, as you do that initial hike, you can be pulling, for example, card A, A1 from recorder 1, A2 from recorder 2, and if you already have a set of empty cards ready to go, you can put those into the unit on that same servicing hike. And so it can make it much more efficient to obtain continuous records of data. But there is a cost that goes with that. So there are pros and cons. What are some of the things that are coming that will change how we deploy equipment, how we collect data? And one of those is extensions of battery life. So even over the last few years, there's been a pretty dramatic extension of how long a recording unit can sit in the field and collect data, from a few weeks up to now a few months for many of the units. But there might be some bigger changes on the horizon. So for example, if we can combine automated approaches with data analysis and do that on the physical recording unit, instead of getting 3 months of recording, what you might get is a text document that has all of the timestamp species name for what's been detected, with a few key clips of those species that you ask it to save. So this doesn't exist right now, but it's something that in 5 or 10 years might be feasible to imagine. And what that would allow is much longer stretches of recording without filling up memory cards, and faster processing as well. From there, something that would be very useful for a variety of applications that we're just beginning to experiment with is what we would call real-time detection and reporting. So it takes this on-device processing where it's currently running an algorithm to detect particular sounds and pairs that with a transmission mechanism so that it's sending a text message or satellite signal each time particular events are detected. And so for things like poaching, for chainsaws, for rare species that you might be trying to put trackers on, this can be very useful for getting relatively instantaneous detections that this event is happening or the species is present, giving ranger teams and park guards time to respond, or allowing biologists to go out and actually capture organisms and put tracking tags on them, things like that. So there are a few of these units in existence now. They tend to be quite power intensive, quite expensive. And so it's not, and you require decent cell phone coverage. So it's not something that we are deploying at large scales in a lot of projects now, but it's also a technology where people are continuing to try to work with it, make it better, make it something that could be used more broadly. And this is one I threw on just because we haven't experimented with it at all, but I think it in the long run might matter a lot. Right now, we put out recording units by hiking to sites or by picking sites that you can drive up to. But if you can get these units small enough and light enough and combine them with powerful drones and other automated deployment approaches, it makes it possible to put recording units in places that are difficult for people to access for a variety of reasons. They might be on a really steep slope. It might be on a military range. It might just be too remote to hike into effectively. It might be at the top of a rainforest canopy. So the ability to put recording units in places where it's hard for people to sample, again, could extend the synergy between human listeners and automated devices by just getting sounds from places where it's historically been hard and allowing humans to then listen to those sounds. When people start passive acoustic monitoring, it's often tempting to think a lot about this stage, the equipment and deployment. What do I need? Where do I put it? And to think less about these following stages. How do I organize the large quantities of data that I'm going to generate? How do I store and secure it? And how do I analyze it? And so one of the first things that comes up once files are coming off of recording units is that a lot of the recording units provide relatively short names. S0001 might be the first file, S0002. And that's fine if you have one unit and you're immediately looking at the data. But over time, these names can get hard to match to individual sites or projects or time periods. Increasingly, some of the recording devices are at least putting the date and timestamp in the file name. But still, by the time you're monitoring in multiple geographic locations for multiple species, it's easy to end up with a bunch of files that you have to look back at your notebook to see where you were at that date and time and make a guess of which project it was part of. So it can be really useful to apply a variety of data management programs to help capture metadata and put some of that metadata in the file name itself so that it's very easy for users to find and identify. In our research group, we've been using a program called Soxomatic that's free. There's a few other things out there that do this. We're actually working now on better data management and curation tools because it's becoming such a big piece of doing these types of projects well. So one of the first things that this program does is to take your original WAV files and convert them to something called FLAC, which is a free lossless audio compression. So it's a different compressed file format. But what it does is make those files about half the size. So if you're generating 8 terabytes of data in a season, and you want that data replicated, that's 16 terabytes of data that you would have to store. So if you're able to do this file conversion, you end up with 8 terabytes, which is cheaper, it's easier to keep track of, it transfers faster. And most sound analysis programs are now capable of reading this FLAC format. But be aware that there are many different types of file compressions out there. So this has been adopted widely within the acoustics community because it is lossless, meaning that all the data are still there, even though it's been compressed. You might also come across compression schemes like MP3 that are capable of compressing data much more so that they're even smaller files. But the way that they do that is by throwing away parts of the original data. So this spectrogram is showing time here on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis, and up here at 16 kilohertz, the sound is pretty much gone above that threshold. And there's also holes and gaps. And if we could zoom in, it's combining multiple samples into sort of an averaged value. And so for human listeners, this is quite effective. It's tuned to our hearing. But if you're trying to analyze species that fall in a different frequency range, or if you're trying to apply automated approaches, some of that averaging and data loss can make it almost impossible to automate analysis of data. And so if you're, I guess the take-home message is that data compression can be very useful for maximizing storage space, but be aware of what compression type you're selecting. So this is a few screenshots of that program. It's called Soxomatic because it makes use of the underlying Sox program, which is a program that we don't develop, and it is for all sorts of audio manipulations. It's a super cool program. But what this program does is make it into a drop-down menu format. So you can do things like convert from WAV to FLAC, where you choose the current location of your sound files, where you want them to go, what file format they are now, what you want them to be, and then you can run it. Likewise, at the same time that you're doing this file conversion, you can also add additional information in the name, such as a project ID that might match in a database and provide information about who's conducting the project, what the target species are. You can file permits for that project in the same broad database, information about what versions of the equipment you were using, all sorts of important key metadata can be matched to that project number, and then that project number can go in the file name. You can also put information about the deployment ID, the site. So this, again, can match to a metadata sheet that has coordinates that correspond to this GPS coordinates, and information about the recording unit itself. When you start a project, you might have 10 identical units, but then one of them gets submerged in a flood, one you have to replace a microphone, and pretty soon you have different generations of equipment all mixed together. And it's really useful to be able to keep track of which particular device it was in case you see files where it hasn't recorded anything, or the microphone input is really faint, or you have a lot of extra detections at 3 sites. And then you go back and see that in all 3 of those sites, that's where you have the newer recording units. It makes it easier to detect patterns in data quality. So in addition to renaming and compressing files with informative names, one of the important things to keep in mind is that data replication is super important. It always makes me nervous when I hear people talk about, this is my hard drive where I keep my data, because all sorts of things can happen to hard drives. It's really important to have 2 copies of them and to keep them in separate locations. As a graduate student, I had a colleague that had beautifully replicated data, 2 copies of it. Both copies were in her computer bag. It got stolen on a bus, and then she lost her entire data set. Likewise, I've seen labs that keep 2 copies of the data, but they're both in the lab. And when somebody breaks into the lab, or when a pipe breaks in the lab above and floods the lab, you lose both copies. So your data replication is really only replicated once those copies are in separate locations. External hard drives like this can be easily damaged and can fail through time. So if you're using these external hard drives, be sure to activate it at least once a year. So plug it into the computer, just look through the files. And what that does is causes the mechanisms inside of it to spin. And so if you don't do that, some of the greases that are used around the moving parts will freeze up, and then you're unable to access the data even though it's still on the drive, which sometimes can be recovered, but is an expensive, long-term, and sort of nerve-wracking process. Beyond just plugging them in once a year, if you're storing data on these types of drives in the long run, you want to be sure to rewrite those data every 3 to 5 years, because you'll actually start to see demagnetization of the drive, where files that were written, individual bits and pieces will start to be corrupt. And so by rewriting the data on the drives, you can keep those magnetizations strong. If you have the option to do it, cloud storage can be a really nice way of keeping one of those data copies. That puts it in the hands of another organization that has professionals that keep track of these sort of things and are often stored on different types of media. So things like Amazon Glacier, where they create a copy of your data and then take it offline in a secure facility that's climate controlled, makes it much cheaper to store data than the typical cloud options. It's in the glacial storage, but where you actually pay is if you need those data back. So if you have a copy on hard drives in your lab that's your working copy, but then you create a backup on something like Amazon Glacier, it's relative, the cost is lower than if you're buying a second set of hard drives and it's someplace else taken care of by somebody else. You still have your copy, and that way if something does happen to the copy that you're working from, that it is someplace else if you absolutely had to recover it. So turning to analysis strategies, there's a variety of ways that you can deal with these long recordings once you get them. One of them is to have humans listen to the recordings. And this works. You can, rather than trying to point count in 10 different locations on 10 different days, you put out 10 recorders and bring them all in, and then you can listen to them back to back. And you can also have a second observer listen to potentially confusing sounds. You can use them for training. So there's lots of advantages, even if you end up listening to the recordings, of having recordings that match specific field sites and point count events. Just because you record data doesn't necessarily mean that you have to analyze all of it. So one of the places where I will see people spend a lot of time is if they were recording for an hour at dawn for a week, and then they end up going through and listening through each hour on every day of the week. It's totally feasible to take 10-minute subsets of that and just listen to 10 minutes, knowing that you have the hour there if you ever want to go back to it for an automated analysis, or you find some rare species in the 10-minute section and you want additional samples of that species. The next faster strategy for analysis is to visually scan through spectrograms. So in the same way that we learn to recognize letters and characters, once you've looked at enough spectrograms, many species of birds will stand out pretty clearly. So for example, the ovenbird that I showed earlier has a series of pulses that's very visually distinctive. And so you can open a 10-minute file and see 1, 2, 3 calls pretty quickly visually, even though it would take a lot longer to listen to them. The next level of computational assistance and challenge is automated detection algorithms. So using a computer to do an initial pass that is then reviewed by a human. And so if you have a species that is relatively rare, or you're trying to find, for example, the start of the season, and you don't want to go through lots of days when the species isn't present, this can be a way of accelerating it. And there's often a hope and a goal of getting to full automation, where you can just run a series of recordings through and get a list of what's there. We are definitely not at that place, although in the last 3 or 4 years, there have been some pretty dramatic advances that have moved us farther from this stage toward this stage. So here's an example of a spectrogram of dawn chorus in sapsucker wood. So this is right outside the office where I typically work. This is 10 minutes of sound, so it would play through these different layers. And this is a human annotation of what's present. And so you can see just how many different species there are and how complicated these spectrograms can be. So this is part of what provides challenges for some of the automated approaches, where there's a lot of overlap between species, and it's not always easy, even for a human observer or for a computer, to parse these overlaps. So can we automate this process? If you think about data analysis and the amount of time involved and the amount of complexity, there's sort of a spectrum from hand review through specialized detectors and then these machine learning approaches. So some of the pros and cons: hand review, it's relatively slow, but you know what you're getting compared to what you would get if you were in the field. You don't have to wonder whether the computer missed sounds, whether it misidentified things. It still has the same errors that a human has. You know, if you're working with a team of people and some of them are more careful than others, there may still be variation in that data, but you have a pretty good understanding of what you're finding. With these specialized detectors, analysis is generally faster, but it can also be more technologically demanding. You need to quantify, build the detector and quantify its performance. I'll talk about 2 examples of this. One is band-limited energy detection, and the second is template detection. And then toward the extreme end of the spectrum are some of the new machine learning approaches, which are potentially quite powerful. It's still pretty early in the development process, but coming along really rapidly. Initially, it required higher levels of technical skill. There's a lot of work going on right now to make it easier and more accessible to apply some of these approaches. And I'll talk about 2 of them today. One is called Birdnet and one is called Kuvu. So starting with one of the automated approaches, band-limited energy detection. The idea of this automated approach is to find moments in a recording when there's a lot of sound at a particular frequency band. And so this is an interface for the detector. I'll show template, or I'll show these detectors in Raven, which is one of the sound analysis softwares. It's free in India. It's what's produced by our group, but there's also, if you're an R user or Python user, various packages that can apply these types of approaches as well. So what you specify is the minimum frequency. So here, 1400 Hertz, which would be down here, the maximum 9200, which would be up here. And so what the program will do is look through in that frequency band for high amplitude events. And you can specify how short they can be, how long they can be, how much they have to be separated by. You can set an exclusion band, which says if there's a lot of sound in the lower frequencies as well, ignore this. So if it's just like a broadband, truck sound, you don't trigger every time there's just a lot of sound everywhere. And this can be pretty effective for finding sounds if it's a relatively quiet background and the sound is quite prominent. And so if you have vocal recordings, for example, you can send this detector through and it will draw boxes around the event each time it happens. By contrast, a template detector gets more specific, where it's putting one or two examples into basically a matrix that slides across the sound file and makes a detection every time there's a good alignment between the template sound and the background sound. So you can see here the alignment wasn't high enough, but in these other calls it was. And so you can set the amount of alignment that has to happen. And this can be a pretty effective way of finding signals as well. At the far end of the spectrum are things like the machine learning approaches. And so there's a couple of phone apps now that use this approach. If you're familiar with either the Birdnet app or the Merlin Sound ID app, or Sound ID part of the Merlin app, you can actually take your phone and make a recording of a bird and ask for the phone identification of that species. And in some areas, these have gotten pretty good. So for example, in North America and Europe, where there's a lot of examples of what these species sound like, the phone identification can be quite accurate. In places where there are fewer examples of what a species sounds like, it's also harder for these models to make an identification of what that species is. And so that's one of the real challenges for these methods going forward, is having examples from especially tropical regions to be able to work through a large community of birds. So this is an example of what one of these apps looks like. Birdnet and Merlin Sound ID tend to run on a phone. The Birdnet app can also run on a computer desktop and on long durations of sound files. So what we'll see, you won't be able to hear me talking while the video is playing over Zoom, but what you'll see is a scrolling spectrogram, and sounds that are currently being produced appear here, and then you'll see the computer attempt to identify them with a count of how many times it's experienced particular sounds. So with two species in a fairly quiet background, this works pretty well. You can see it identifying blue jays and titmice. But as we get into more complicated soundscapes and more species, these approaches are still definitely developing. So this is now something that you can run on a Windows desktop. And this is one of the links in the document that we'll distribute at the end. But you can download something that opens to look like this, where it says, where are your sound recordings? Where do you want the detections to go? What is the latitude and longitude of your site? Is there a particular week of the year that you want it to look at, or do you want species that are there at any time of year? And then you can run this analysis, and what it will give you is detection tables that look something like this, where it says, what is the beginning and end time of the detection, and then what species might be there, and what is the confidence of the program. So at one extreme, you'll see some pretty high confidence scores. So I feel pretty good about the fact that this is a yellow-bellied sapsucker. This is probably not a barred owl. So it would be awesome if the program could definitively say, yes, this is definitely this species, and it's definitely not this species. But instead, what you get is a range of, I'm pretty confident that this is, and this might be, and this probably isn't. And so statistically, there are ways of dealing with that. So if you think about how confident you are that a particular detection comes from a particular species, there are ways to evaluate the program. So you can take between 100 and 300 detections that have different confidence values. And then for each of those detections, say, that wasn't correct, or yes, it was correct. And so in theory, as your confidence value is higher, you should have more correct detections, and can fit a logistic regression to ask, okay, let's say I want 90% of the detections that I get are actually the species that I hope it is. What is the confidence threshold that I should be using for that to be true? And these confidence thresholds are going to be different by species and sometimes different by site. So for example, there's a South American bird called a tinamou. If it has a confidence value of 0.1, it's almost certainly a tinamou. Where other species, even by the time it's 0.99, it might not be that species. And so it might need to be 0.998 before it's actually, this curve goes from incorrect detection to correct detection. But with some investment, you can set thresholds that are pretty meaningful and process large quantities of data. One of the major limitations for these approaches is the availability of example calls. And so this is something in computational support. So something that we've been working on in collaboration with the computational community, where we've been posting prizes and data sets asking people to improve the identification of the species. So in 2023, this competition has been run with species from Eastern Africa. In 2024, we're hoping to use species from the Western Ghats in collaboration with a variety of researchers who are providing initial training data examples from this region. And the final approach that I'll talk about today is, what do you do if your species isn't in Birdnet? So let's say you're working on something that's endemic to a region, there's not a lot of examples, or I'm actually going to use an insect example to show this program because there just weren't insects built into some of these machine learning approaches. And so this is a package called Kugu that's been developed by a computer scientist who is working in our lab group. And what it allows you to do is to provide your own data and train your own machine learning model. And so there's a quick start guide for this. This is all linked in the handout. But it was originally developed for the detection and classification of insect sounds. And so there are lots of species of insects in the same habitat. And we were able to take examples of each of those species and generate a library of example sounds, curate and check those, build the model, provide various data augmentations, so infuse noise, stretch and shift them to correspond to slightly larger body sizes or different temperatures, and then develop a set of data that was basically our gold standard answer key that we could compare what humans found and what the model found to evaluate performance. And so this is an example of the type of data that comes out. It's about 5 months of recording, and sunset is here, sunrise is here. So each of these columns is a day. And the darker a spot is at a particular time on a particular day, the more detections there are of that species. So you can start to see seasonal patterns in activity and also daily patterns in activity. This is a species that calls mostly between 4 and 6 a.m. So there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from these files. So although this package was originally developed for this particular insect research project, it's now publicly available as a Python package. So it sits in Google Collab. There's basically a web page where you see code blocks that you can go through and run with examples, or you can replace it with your own, replace those examples with your own data. So you have individual Google Drive folders that represent the sounds you're trying to find. So species 1, species 2, species 3, and then those train. So you can define different model structures and data augmentation, but you can also evaluate how well the model is performing through the code. And one of the things that's on the horizon that I find really exciting is that once you have your model built, you can actually import it into sound analysis programs like Raven and use it as a drop-down menu. So if you build a model and are working with lots of students or collaborators, you can take that model that you've built with a DOI and give it to lots of different people, and they can just see it as a drop-down menu without having to interact with the Python interface. So hopefully as these different tools and techniques come together, it gives us the ability to monitor for many different species. This is about a 24-hour stretch of sound from Panama. Within this, you see monkeys, you see oropendulas, you see parrots. And so this is just a really rich data set that as the technology parts continue to come together, there's a lot of opportunities, both for the technique itself as well as for freeing up humans to do other types of research that complement the acoustic data. So some of the advantages are the ability to sample over time and space, create an enduring record, move through large quantities of data. But it will be an ongoing challenge and very important to make sure that we're quantifying these models and their performance well. And it remains difficult to estimate distance or abundance in the way that human observers would. So I want to again mention that there's a document with some resources for different programs that are used in sound analysis, places to learn more about it, and we're also happy to answer questions. So thank you all very much for your engagement and attention.
Thank you so much, Laurel, for that wonderful talk. While we wait for a few questions to pop up in Discord, I think there was a question that asked if it can be used to study insects like katydids, but I think you covered that towards the end of the talk. I had a question that actually ties back to the first talk of the mini symposia. I think a speaker was talking about how estimating relative abundance is fairly hard. And I wonder if you can talk a bit more about advances in how we're getting at estimating abundance using bioacoustic or passive acoustic data.
Yeah, there's sort of a technological approach to that and also a biological approach. So, if we're able to activate techniques like localization, that can make it much easier where you have multiple microphones that are triangulating on a particular sound source. Right now, that has remained difficult in part because the clocks of the units have to be perfectly synchronized, and the technology is generally not that stable. So you get errors that are much greater than the distance between units. But as as that technological frontier advances, that will help. The other part is the biological side of just understanding enough about the ecology of the animal to be able to know, do signaling rates change a lot when the density changes? Do they change during different times of year, different mating interactions, to be able to map the number of detections to the underlying population structure? But it's actually remained a pretty tricky one.
Thanks, Laurel.
A lot of us come wanting.
Yeah. So another question with respect to, I think you were showing a couple of these probabilities for that were coming out of the Birdnet outputs, right? Like you were talking about how a probability of over 0.8, you're fairly confident that it's that species, but one that it's much lower, obviously we're not confident that it's that particular species. There were other talks earlier today which were using different thresholds of probability, say above 0.6 would be, we're confident that it's a particular detection. How do we go about deciding what's a good threshold for us to be confident that that species was detected?
Yeah, in general, it would be nice if we could get to the point where there was one number that worked for many different species. My experience with those approaches has been that it's often a species by species engagement. And so 0.6 might work really well for a particular species at dividing things that are usually correct and usually aren't. But it's so variable by species that it usually involves going through by hand quite a few of those detections to really understand where the transition point occurs for different species, and then keep that set of detections that you've gone through by hand so that as different versions of the model come, you can just apply that to the same set of detections that you've already validated if it requires a different threshold for a new version of the model.
Right. Okay. I have another question in the chat, which I'm going to read out. Ram K asks, are there portable devices that can download SD card data onto portable hard disks, or the use of phones with OTG type devices to make it easier for efficient data storage and management?
There are devices that can download an SD card. The challenge in this particular scenario is that there's typically enough data on that SD card that the download time might still be 30 or 40 minutes. And so sometimes that might make sense if you're just off grid and you don't have a computer to go back to, but you can charge up this device with a solar panel or something like that. But if you're trying to visit multiple recorders in a day, you typically spend so long standing at one downloading data that it's a noticeable piece of the time budget. And those cards often have enough data that you fill up a device that you would offload to within a couple of units.
Thanks, Laurel. I think a couple of other questions might, come again on Discord after our session ends. But for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you again for agreeing to give a talk so early for you. And it was wonderful to hear about all of this research. And I'm now going to hand it over to Varun, who's going to close today's session and make a couple of announcements for tomorrow's set of talks. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Vijay. I have some announcements for tomorrow, but before that, just let's summarize what we heard today. So we had a total of 9 talks in the Passive Acoustics mini symposium, and that was followed by 9 posters, which ranged from in which the topics ranged from tech-based monitoring to wetland surveys and many other things that went beyond counts and normal snapshot surveys. For those who missed some of the talks or the posters, the links are available in Discord. You can go back and watch any of the talks that you might have missed, and the posters will remain on the Discord server till the symposium ends. Tomorrow, we have another exciting lineup of speakers. In the morning, we have the resurveys and follow-up expeditions mini symposium, in which we'll have 6 talks, including few from Indian researchers and few people who have looked at who have resurveyed birds abroad. After that, we have 12 posters in which the topics range from snapshot surveys, surveys looking at habitat relationships, citizen science, and community engagement. We also have a panel discussion which will discuss the role of resurveys and follow-up expeditions in improving our understanding of birds and bird monitoring in general. So we start at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and I hope to see all of you there tomorrow. I hope today's session was interesting and you enjoyed it, and looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Thank you.